Hey, what's up, everybody? Jay Helms here, founder of W2Capitalist.com. Want to let you know what's coming up in this next video is today, earlier today, members of our mastermind group had a chance to do a one-on-one session with Doc G. If you're not familiar who Doc G is, he runs the blog over at diversefi.com. And he also is a co-host of What's Up Next podcast. Highly recommend you check them out there because they look at not only diversifying your income through real estate investing, but through other means. Back to Doc G's story, he has been able to acquire enough rental properties to become to go from being a full-time physician to a part-time physician. And what I love about his story is he's been able to do it with just 4 doors, which, it's amazing because it seems like in the real estate investing world, we all kind of secretly judge one another about how many doors do you have. And this guy set out on his goal, what he wanted to accomplish, and was able to attain it with just 4 doors and the cash flow that those 4 condos do for him. So that's coming up next. So right here at the very beginning, we're kind of chit-chatting in the video, and then he does a little introduction about his story, and then we get into the questions from the mastermind members. So to find out more about the mastermind, head over to W2Capitalist.com. Let's get to work. On this computer. And the funny thing is, so I know we're recording now, but I record all of our mastermind calls, and for whatever reason, I don't do it until like 10 or 15 minutes in. I think, oh gosh. But anyway, so welcome everybody. Welcome, Doc G. Thank you for joining us. This is I almost called it a one-on-one, but it's kind of like 4-on-1 or 5-on-1 with Doc G. And these are members of the W2 Capitalist Mastermind Group. Most of us couldn't join today because they're busy working and this didn't fit on their lunch schedule or whatnot. But Doc G has had some success on investing in real estate, so we wanted to pick his brain a little bit. So Doc G, with that, if you can give us a brief intro of where you are now with your real estate portfolio and you're kind of focused on real estate and what that means to you, and then we'll get into some of the questions. Does that sound good?
Sure. So I'm Doc G. I have a blog called diversefi.com. That's diversefi.com, as well as a podcast called the What's Up Next podcast. And my origin story is pretty boring. I grew up in a middle-class family, but I had parents who were fairly financially savvy, and they modeled really good financial behavior for me. Some of that included things like they tended to save a lot more than they spent, and they tended to not buy things they didn't need. But they also had very extensive W-2 jobs as well as side hustles. My stepdad, for instance, owned a coin business. So he was in the healthcare field and was a CEO of a healthcare company, but he also had a small coin business he ran out of the house and would buy and sell coins online in the 70s and 80s. Part of their side hustles was also real estate. So I think at their highest point, my parents owned maybe 10 or 13 doors, not only in the Chicagoland area, which is where we live, but also in Arizona and Colorado. And so I grew up watching them manage the real estate. They had some land, they had some apartment complexes, they had some single family homes. And so as a kid, I would follow around with my stepdad as he went to these different apartments, and I'd watch him, pull up the carpet and clean the driveway. And I'd watch every month as the rent checks came in and would listen to them grumble when they didn't. And even remember them having to call a lawyer a few times or track people down. So there were all sorts of great stories about it. And then I watched my mom, who was an accountant, looking at the ledger and paying attention to the properties and how they were doing and when it was time to buy and when it was time to sell. So I personally wanted to become a physician pretty much from the day I can remember. And as I was becoming an adult and becoming a physician, it was fairly natural for me to consider real estate as part of what I did. Our first property, my wife and I bought actually more as a luxury purchase. We live in the suburbs of Chicago and bought a condo right in the middle of the city in this beautiful area that we love to hang out in. And we had 2 young kids at the time, and we went to the condo every weekend for a few months and then realized that it just wasn't practical and that kids were not having as much fun as we thought they would. And so we decided to rent that condo out. And it was a really amazing thing because although I grew up with parents who were always buying and selling and renting real estate, I had never done it myself. So we fell into this situation where we had the condo, we rented it, and I was able to rent it within a few weeks. And we made a little bit of money on it. And 6 to 12 months in, the real estate market dropped out. And my wife and I had some extra cash because I was a physician and she was a computer consultant, and we were savers just like my parents were and just like her parents were. And so we started looking for foreclosures, and we found another condo in a really great area in Lincoln Park, which is part of the Chicagoland area. It's right by some of the universities, and we knew it was highly rentable. So we went to the bank and we lowballed them. And I remember the realtor for the bank said, "Oh, there's no way they're going to accept this." And lo and behold, they eventually did. And we did some construction on that condo and rented it out. And Chicago is I believe, is a hard market for real estate. And it was one of the few properties where we were able to meet the 1% rule. We're not always able to. And after that, we bought a house in Wisconsin on the lakefront. And again, it was another foreclosure. And we kind of used the same method. We went in mostly with cash and then borrowed some money from our family members and then took out a line of credit on some of our investments. And we held that for a number of years. And then the real estate market improved quite a bit. And we sold the house in Wisconsin to a neighbor without lawyers. I'm sorry, not without lawyers, without realtors, but with lawyers. So it was incredibly inexpensive. And we took all that money and did a 1031 exchange and bought 2 more condos in that area in Chicago called Lincoln Park, which we knew really well. We had lived there before, and it's always a hopping area, and it's close to a lot of businesses as well as universities. So we know there's always a huge supply of renters. And that's how we've been existing to this point with 4 rental properties. They're all condos right now. We've been renting out properties for about 10 years. We now have 4, and I've had 1 condo not rented for 2 weeks, but otherwise they've been rented almost the whole time we've owned them.
Wow. So there was a lot that you just threw that I would like to unpackage personally there. That was good stuff. But I do want to make sure we get to some of these questions from the rest of the members. James submitted a question earlier. So James, you still got that question? You want to go ahead and throw that Doc G and let him field that one?
Let me find out which one of the questions was to ask you.
Well, here I got it right here. So the sake of time, I'll ask it for you. So, so talking about your condos there in Chicagoland, you referred it to Chicagoland, which I like. So, James, your question was, how does this asset class perform during recessions, and what metrics did you use to decide where to invest? Were 2 of the questions that James you posted. So,
and specifically, I was thinking also when I think of condos, I think of the condo association fees and how those fees play into your investment decisions.
So actually, let me break that down into both questions and answer the second part of that, James. So first and foremost, we picked areas that we knew. So I had gone to medical school in Chicago. My wife went to college in Chicago, and we grew up, both of us, in the suburbs. So we looked for areas in which we knew were highly rentable. In this case, it was condos that were close to universities and condos that were close to the train system.
Okay.
And we also looked for wealthier areas. So we weren't buying, there's a class system, right? Class 1 versus class 2 versus class 3 properties. We looked for the more class 1 type properties, the ones that would get a more established clientele. So we wanted to make sure that wherever we bought these rental properties, that they would always be full, even in downturns. Now, when it comes to the economics, you're right. There's totally a few things you have to look at, and HOAs are part of it. So the assessments that you have for a condo, because condos are part of condo associations, so you're going to have to pay a monthly assessment, and then real estate taxes. So that's really going to determine whether your condo is going to cash flow, obviously, depending on whether you have a mortgage or not and how much of a mortgage you have. But the two variables that you can really control are the assessments and the real estate taxes. So for instance, in our first property, which we bought more as a luxury purpose for fun and then eventually turned it into a rental, that's probably, we have our worst numbers on that one. And the reason why is it rents for $2,300 and our assessments are about $950.
Wow.
Taxes are about 2,000 to 3,000 a year. So that one's a little bit tighter. The rest of them aren't as tight as that. But you also have to realize that condos don't really cost much to maintain. So unlike a single family home or a building, you may be spending a lot more in upkeep. We've owned these 4 condos now, some of them as long as 10 years, some of them just for 4 or 5 years, but we haven't even painted any of them yet. So we really have only paid small amounts for upkeep. This year we did have an air conditioner go out, so that cost about $4,000. We had a window issue at one point, and they, the pain of condo associations is the windows had to be a very specific type, a Pella window that was really expensive, and they were a regular size. So there are times when we do pay some here and there, but because the upkeep is so much less than larger properties, we've found that even if you don't necessarily meet the 1% rule, even if your rent is not exactly as high as you'd like it to be, that you can still pull a profit out of it.
Yeah, one point I want to make before I forget is, HOA and condo association fees. I like that they're established for a couple of reasons. I also don't like that they're established for a couple of reasons. But if you're looking at buying a property like you're talking about here, HOA fees are not fees. HOA bylaws and restrictions and guidelines are different from property to property. There is no standard, at least in Florida. What I've seen, there's no standard, meaning that it could be that in certain condo or HOA situations, especially in an attached dwelling, whether it's a single family attached or it's a PUD or it's a condo, the owner may be required for the exterior maintenance of the building, and in some cases, the association is responsible. So that can get into the numbers too, right, Doc?
Yeah, and you have to be really careful about the rules of the association, because some of these condo associations will only allow, for instance, 50% of their units to be rented at a time. Or if you have a smaller condo association, it's possible sometime in the future they may vote to change the condo association rules and eventually stop allowing rentals.
Yeah.
So we were very careful in the places we chose to make sure that the likelihood of them ever not allowing rentals were small. So a number of the places where we own units in have a majority of rentals, or at least 50% of rentals. So the likelihood a condo board will ever vote rentals out is pretty small.
Yeah, great point. And I've got a story there about that too. Buying a property and not realizing that it was in a vacation area and it's not allowed to be a vacation condo. I've got a story, but I won't bore you with that. So, James, you got any other questions? Any follow-up questions?
Yeah, the only other follow-up question that I had it seems like the other 3 or so properties that you purchased were through the foreclosure process. So at what percent of a discount were you able to get, those properties as compared to what they would normally go for?
So let's talk about, so one of the condos we got in foreclosure, we bought it for $200,000. And I would say within a year, it probably could have been sold for $300,000. It was listed for $220,000, and we went in with $200,000 and refused to budge. And eventually the bank sold to us. The property that we bought a property in Wisconsin. It was a beachfront property. It was in foreclosure. We bought it for $400,000. We put $50,000 into it and pretty much renovated all the bathrooms, the bedrooms. We put in hardwood floors. We rented it for 3 or 4 years, and then we sold it for $700,000 without a realtor. So I would say that we got at least a 20% discount on the first, if not more. And the second one had been listed as high as $800,000 or $900,000 before it went into foreclosure. So I think we got a pretty huge discount. As I progress in real estate, I stop looking at what I'm going to make by reselling the unit, right? Because at first I thought I was going to be a speculator. I didn't have the words for this when I first started. I just had an idea of how to buy real estate. So when you buy real estate and you're hoping that you're buying it in a down market, you're taking advantage of inefficiencies in the market. If you're planning on reselling it and making a big profit, it's really more likely speculation. As I get older and move farther, I look more to investment. So what I'm looking for is a property I can buy and cash flow on it immediately. And that's now how I consider. Now, don't get me wrong. I am a big fan of appreciation. If my unit happens to appreciate and I can sell it in a bunch of years and make a lot of money, that's great. But ultimately, I now look at it more as what kind of cash flow can I make from the unit, and how can I exist off of that, or at least use that cash flow for other things.
Cool. Great stuff, man. So what I think are going to be some quick hit questions that submitted to the group earlier. So Annette, who wasn't able to join us today, she submitted, how did you organize your business structure? Was it an LLC or limited partner for asset protection? She's, we talked on Sunday about asset protection. She's really focused on that. So if you can get into that a little bit, and I think when you get into it, you're going to answer the second one, which she asked, at what point did you start organizing? And what point, meaning how many doors did you have before you started organizing that way? And what's the best advice for new investors?
So I've thought about asset protection a lot because I'm a physician and because we have excess liability compared to your average person. And the reason why is our malpractice liability can overshoot our malpractice limits. And therefore, we're at risk for losing personal property as well as what we own within the business. So I started thinking about asset protection from day one. Which is probably different than a lot of people who kind of start slowly into real estate. I also had my parents as an example. So when my parents started buying investment properties, there really weren't LLCs, or it wasn't that easy to put a property in an LLC. So they used balloon policies to protect themselves, or excuse me, umbrella policies to protect themselves. So the first thing I did was make sure I had a reasonable umbrella policy. So I bought an umbrella policy for a few $1,000,000. It's really inexpensive. It'll cost you a few $100s a year. And I think that's kind of layer one of asset protection. I also decided to put my properties into LLCs fairly immediately. The first one I didn't because it was more, again, a luxury and we weren't renting it out in the beginning. But with properties 2, 3, and 4, we put them immediately, entitled them within the LLCs. I did an extra layer of protection because I'm a physician, so they're in my wife's name. So the LLC it's a single person LLC, so we can report it directly on our taxes. And being a single person LLC, we have her name in it and not mine to avoid any of that excess physician liability. So we did this immediately. In Illinois, it's a little bit more complicated. You can have like a parent LLC and then a series of baby LLCs below that for each of your properties. But at the time we started doing this, that hadn't really been proven to hold up in court. So what we eventually did was put each property into a separate LLC, at least to start with. Now we own 2 LLCs and we have 2 properties in each. Which does give us a little excess liability, right? Because if someone
Correct.
falls and hurts themselves within one property and sues us for millions and millions of dollars, they could possibly also get to our other property within that LLC. Technically, if you want to be perfect about it, you would open up a new LLC for each property.
Yeah, here in the parent-child LLC structure I'm glad you said that, because one of our other members, Jared Dean, I think it was Jared that asked this question. He's not on. It's probably real early. He's a soldier serving in Afghanistan right now. So we haven't gotten in that part of our discussion on Sunday too about parent-child dependabilities and stuff like that. So good to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah,
so,
they call them a series, an LLC. If you can do an LLC
okay.
in series, right? So you have the parent company and then you have a series of LLCs for each property underneath the parent company.
Yeah.
And then each one is in a separate one.
And as real estate investors, we've all heard the line, it's not a matter of I've already screwed it up, but you're going to get sued. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. You probably heard that double time being a physician, right? Because it's not a matter of if you get sued as a physician, it's a matter of when, right? I
Yeah,
don't,
yeah.
and you and I talked a little bit before, before the other folks jumped on, and how our world's kind of, we were in the same, some of the similar things, and I've get exposure to your world just a little bit, and how I don't, there's just so much that goes on in that world that can lead to liability issues, which is the reason why, your malpractice insurance probably has exponentially increased over your career from when you started. So, hop into the next question right here, presented by Gwaith, who I call Mr. Smith because I struggle with his first name. But his question was, did you transition to part-time position after your half of your income was replaced, or your income was not half, but some of your income was replaced, and if so, how were you able to make that transition from full to part-time, being a physician?
So I'm again strange, I think, a little bit in this field because financial independence nor retire early were a big part of my path until the end. Um, I felt a strong connection to being a physician. My father was a physician. He died when I was young. So I kind of grew up with this idea of following in his footsteps. So I hadn't thought a lot about transitioning out, but as I got older, I started burning out a little bit in medicine, and with some of the stresses involved, started saying, well, where am I financially, and how can I make this job a little bit more livable? At that time, I discovered the personal finance world and realized that I was already financially independent. And by that time, I already owned a number of properties. So I never specifically thought I'm going to build this real estate empire, use it to cash flow, and then pull back on work. I think it all kind of happened at the same time. So I could have quit work completely probably 3-4 years ago. Uh, I decided to transition to what I would call a half schedule or half retirement more because there are parts of work I still really love. And so I wanted to hold on to those. But I never thought of it in terms of uh, replacement, W-2 replacement. I think it's an excellent way, however, if you're looking to get out of your W-2 job in the future, or at least cut down on it, I think you have to have at least 50% of your income covered. Not even your income covered, it has to be 50% of your needs before you start pulling back. The wonderful thing, there are a few wonderful things about real estate investments. As you guys know, a big part of it is depreciation. So if you can cash flow $50,000 and your rental properties are valued high enough where you can allay the tax burdens from that with depreciation, that goes a far way, right? Because if you're taking home $50,000, if you were to do that in your W-2, depending on what tax bracket you're in, you might have to make $75,000 or $80,000 to actually take home $50,000. So there are real benefits using depreciation to allay your taxes and therefore give you a higher cash flow. You might not have to get to 100% replacement of your W-2 income, but I think you've got to be at least halfway there before you get serious about pulling away from your W-2. People forget the W-2, I call it the W-2 asset class. The W-2 asset class is incredibly powerful. And the reason why it's powerful is it doesn't cost anything, or at least whatever it did cost, your education, your training, all that you already paid for. So it's one of the few places where you can go and create money from nothing. And it's not exactly nothing, right? It's time and energy. But if you want to go out and buy a real estate property, or if you want to make money on index funds, you need cash to start. Whereas in the W-2 asset class, you can start with zero cash and produce something. So if you really want to be a real estate mogul, something that I did, and I think a lot of people consider, is keep on working that W-2, make extra cash, and after you've maxed out your tax deferred pathways like your 401k, et cetera, take that money, whatever's left over, and use it to buy properties
Yeah.
and pay off the mortgages on those properties. And then when you have multiple properties with a very good cash flow, you can get out of the W-2 and be in a very strong place financially.
Yeah, that's very good. You know, and I'll admit one of my guilty pleasures, you brought up taxes, and one of my guilty pleasures is seeing how much money I don't pay the government because of write-offs and whatnot. I'm going to have to look this up, but I want to ask you a question about a particular strategy here in a minute because I just learned about it this morning and I wanted to see if you had um, any insight on. But I'm going to look up the phrase because I already forgot it. So I'm going to jump to the next question. Posted by Jamie, who also is not able to join us today. He's a hardworking W2 guy, just as well. Not to mention that none of y'all who are on here are not. I didn't mean it that way. But his question, and this goes back to me mixing up condo and vacation rental. So I'm going to ask it the way he worded it, but I think it applies here too, because for those of you who don't know, talking to Doc G here, asking him about his portfolio and how his properties, he said condo rentals, which I interpreted to vacation rentals, which is not the case. He does have long-term rentals in his condos. So that's a Pensacola Beach frame of mind. So sorry about that. So Jamie's question is, what kind of vacation rental or condo rental would you look at buying as a first one for somebody who has a young family? And how do you evaluate this vacation, but condo market to determine if the deal makes sense in general? And what would you avoid as a first condo rental? And you went into some of those a little bit earlier, but more specifically, Jamie, he's a younger guy. He's got a young family. I would like to say I'm in that same boat, but I think he's a little younger than me. He's looking at, if we're looking at a condo to purchase, what are some of the things that he should look at buying his first one?
So this is actually a perfect example of what I didn't do, but I would do now if I knew back then. So forget a condo. You want to buy a 2 or a 3 flat or even a small building in which you can live in and then rent out the other units. So that's called house hacking, right?
Yeah.
So if you can buy a 3 flat because you need somewhere to live anyway, and you may want to consider purchasing a house, you're going to get a mortgage as the getting a mortgage for a primary house is a heck of a lot easier than getting a mortgage for a rental property. So buy a 3 flat, live in 1 unit, rent the other 2 units out, live there for 3 or 4 or 5 years. As you make money in your W2 and as you use everyone else's rent to cover your costs, eventually you'll have enough money, move out of that 3 flat, rent out the one you were in, and then buy another 3 flat and do
Yeah,
the same thing
and I was gonna say
over and
that,
over again.
and the one thing we haven't done that again. If I would think about it again, it would be great. But the one thing to consider there also is that you only have to come up with, maybe a 3%, 3.5% down payment if you're able to do an FHA loan, which will require you to live in one of those units. So your initial cost of acquisition could be much lower than it would when you typically buying some kind of a apartment complex or building.
Yeah, and this is the soft way to get into real estate because one is you live on site. So if you go and buy a single family home, you're going to be sitting around one day and a pipe is going to break or a bathroom's not going to work. All this kind of stuff you're going to deal with anyway. You might as well have your first real estate experience be like your first homeowner's experience. So when your tenant comes and said the toilet is broken, it's like the toilet in your house is broken. So how do you deal with it? You either fix it yourself or you call someone to help you. But the point is, it's a real gentle way to get into real estate. And as James mentioned, it's much easier to get a mortgage. The mortgage is going to be at a much lower rate. And it's a really good way to get into real estate if you are a young family and if you're just starting out. And that's where you learn how to be a landlord. Just to answer the rest of the question, so what else do I look for when I'm buying a condo? So first and foremost, it has to be rentable. So location is everything, right? So it doesn't have to be a rich area. It doesn't have to be a poor area. It doesn't have to be a middle class area. Any of those will work as long as it's highly rentable. The next thing I'm going to look at is the HOAs, right? So a place that has high HOAs, the numbers are never going to work. And the HOAs are just going to keep increasing every year. Real
And
estate taxes.
when you say high HOA fees, how do you relate something that's high? Are you relating that to a percentage of your rental income, or is there just a standard, like the place that we just left? We just moved from, it was $300 a month to the place where we live now. It's $100, $150 a year. You know, completely different properties. But and then the property across the street, it was like $600 a month. So how do you get into what is high for you? What do you consider that? How do you equate to what is high?
So kind of right. The rule of thumb is you would like to be able to keep 50% of your rents collected. Right. So if I'm going to rent a condo for $2,000, I'd like to take home roughly $1,000 or a little bit less a month. So to do that, I have $1,000 left for expenses. So between the HOAs, the real estate taxes, whatever homeowners insurance I need, and whatever maintenance I'm going to have, I don't want that going much over $1,000. So, you can toggle depending on what things are. So some places that I'll buy have a little bit higher HOA, but then they have a little bit lower real estate tax, right? So maybe I'm buying a condo in a building that has a front desk and has a nice pool and has a workout area. Well, so the HOA might be slightly higher, but then maybe in that area, the real estate taxes are low. So it's all about trying to kind of hit that number such that your overall cost per month for the unit still allows for some profit.
Yeah. Yeah. That 50% rule is a good rule of thumb. But I would suggest once you hit that, if that hits your metrics, then you got to really dive in to make sure it's going to do that from a little bit deeper analysis, right?
Yeah, these are, so as always, numbers are guides, right? So the 1% rule, the 2% rule, that 50% rule, all of it are just basic guides. None of it matters if some of, if some of the details don't work. So again, if you buy a condo and later on realize that in the condo association rules, you can only have it rented 1 out of every 5 years, you're not going to make money on that unit.
Yeah.
But if you don't pay attention to the condo association rules, if you don't pay attention to the real estate tax, if you don't pay attention to the HOA, if you get the wrong location, all these things are going to make your condo a poor buy.
Yeah. Yep. So I found the term I was looking at or thinking about earlier. So you're talking about paying the properties off to where, you get more cash flow. The term or the phrase that was used earlier was called velocity banking strategy. Are you familiar with that at all?
No, I've never heard that term.
I hadn't either until this morning. And basically, it sounds kind of bass backwards to me, to where basically you take a HELOC and you apply that HELOC to a mortgage that you have on a rental property, and then you pay off the HELOC. It sounded weird, but it sounded like it was something I want to dive into more, because it kind of goes, the conversation thread was, here's a way to pay off your properties faster to increase your cash flow faster. But I'm just sitting here thinking most HELOCs have a higher interest rate than you do on I don't know. It just, if you knew about it, I was going to ask you to explain it to me a little bit further, but that's fine.
Yeah,
Jay, we've looked at that before too, and I think it's just based on the way that it's simple interest versus compounded interest.
Okay.
It's not amortized over time. I think that's the premise on it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember, just kind of as a general principle, everyone starts in real estate loving leverage. And as you go further and own more and have a little bit more wealth, you start moving away from leverage.
Yeah.
And the reason why is leverage works great when the market's great. But when you get a really piss poor market, leverage can hurt you. So I think if you are at the beginning and need to lever, I think that's fine. And in fact, something like house hacking is a great way to lever. I think if you're getting into really complex leverage schemes, just realize if the bottom falls out of the market, you'll probably be at risk. I've decided to not leverage,
Right.
And I was able to do that because I had a W2 job that provided high enough wages that I could bank all that money and do it that way. And I will make less of a percentage on my money than someone who's willing to lever. In some ways, I'll probably make less on my money sometimes than index fund investing does. But it's completely uncorrelated with the stock market, which is really nice. And
That
there's
cash flows.
it cash flows with tax benefits.
Yeah.
And then finally, a lot of these properties, although I don't calculate in appreciation as part of my profits, will eventually appreciate, at least keeping up with inflation. So if I make 5% on my property, but then that equals 7 or 8% because I'm not really paying taxes at least up front on it, and then I get another few percentage with inflation and it cash flows, all of those are really great positives that you don't get from just basic index investing.
Yeah, I struggle when people, and I'm guilty of this too, but they, you compare what the stock market's doing versus the return on a rental property. I'm like, well, they're not the same. It's definitely you just said it. There's cash flow and there's tax benefits that I don't think the same people who invest in stocks are going to see. Now the returns may be the same, but I'd much rather have. I'm just going to spitball some numbers. I'd much rather have a 5% return on a property that cash flows every month and provides me those tax benefits versus an 8% return on stocks. That's just the way I look at it. But again, it goes back to what you're driven by, what your goals are, what your purpose for investing in real estate is. So I've got a couple more questions, but I want to make sure Kim, Melody, James, you guys have any more? You're good. Kim's good. Okay. Melody, chime in if you got something. If not, I'm going to keep going, but chime in if you've got a question. But so, G, you and I talked a little bit before we started recording this about, how you make that transition from full-time employee to part-time employee. So that's one of the things, our group is focused on. The W2 Capitalist are people who have a full-time job who also focus on real estate investing, whether it be passive or active investing. So one of the things that you and I are talking about is as I'm on I didn't mention this earlier, but I feel like I'm on a 3 to 5 year plan. If everything hits that I have drawn it on paper, I'll be much closer to having that financial independence. And as we're getting closer, my wife and I are getting closer to that financial independence, that I start thinking about, okay, how is this really going to look like? What's this really going to look like for us? And my struggle already, and again, it's a 3 to 5 year plan, is mentally making that shift from working a W-2 job full time, which I've done for, let's just call it 20 years, right? To not having one and doing more. I'm afraid of what I may do with that freedom. It's like, so my question is, how do you mentally prepare, even going to part-time, because you and I talked about this a little bit about your fear of making that transition. You've kind of stopped, and correct me where I'm wrong, but you kind of do part-time because you elect to do part-time. Now your job is a lot more noble than what I do, right? I mean, there's a real driven purpose. You're really helping folks who are sick and need that kind of assistance. And judging by what I know of your personality, you have a great knack for that, right? So, and I'm trampling over my words here, but what are some of the things, as people are trying to make that mental shift? This year I've been talking a lot about mindset, and we're going through some things that just go back to making sure your mind's right. What are some of the things that if somebody's going to make that shift this year, whether it be the next 3 months, 6 months, or for me, this is more of a personal question for me, 3 to 5 years down the road, what are some of the mental things that you need to be thinking about and preparing yourself for to have that mindset correct to make that shift?
So I think this is a great question, even for people who are just starting out in the workplace. And the reason why is that ultimately you want to spend your time in life doing something that gives you a sense of purpose and a meaning, and that solidifies your identity. And the $1 million question for everyone is, well, what is that? And there's no easy answer. And your purpose and identity may change over time. So it's not necessarily even set in stone. So whether you're 20 years old and going to retire in 30 or 40 years, or whether you're 40 years old and are going to retire in 3 to 5 years, I think all of us should be looking at our lives and trying to figure out what really gets us excited, what makes life livable, where do we find purpose in life, and trying to gently build those things into our life now, regardless of where we are on the retirement or non-retirement continuum.
Yeah.
And the reason why is ultimately some people find purpose in work, but a lot of us don't. And you will get to a point where you're financially independent enough, whether it be through real estate or investments, that you could leave work. But if you don't have hobbies, interests, or even work maybe you don't get paid for, but that brings you happiness or contentedness, if you don't have those things, you're going to find yourself fairly unhappy and anxious once you
Yeah.
leave your job. And the reason why is it takes you about a week or two to get used to not working anymore. But it could take you a lifetime to fill in that extra time you have.
Yeah. And so, and part of that question for me, so my dad recently retired. He was a fireman, and he loved his job, you know, and if you ask him today, he will tell you retiring was the worst thing he ever did, because the camaraderie was there. You know, he had a sense of purpose, you know, and he just loved it. You know, I've never met anybody who loved their job as much as he did his, you know, but it was time for him to do it, you know, and it was, well, he will disagree with that, but it made more financially, and this is the weird thing, it made more sense for him to retire than it did for him to stay on. I don't get it, but that's the way their compensation was set up. So, you know, one of the things that, so I've just been thinking about that and having conversations with him about that. So let me jump to a couple more questions here. You mentioned,
Can I add one thing?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
will say, for the grand majority of us, real estate investing will not be our purpose. I'm
No,
going to say
yeah,
that again. For the grand majority of us, real estate investing will not be our purpose. So if you think you're going to leave your job and that being a real estate investor will take up all your time and give you a sense of meaning, purpose, and identity after you leave your job, probably 90% of us will be unhappy with that. 10% of us will just love it, and they'll teach courses on how to do it, and they'll have a podcast about it, and blah, blah, blah. But the other 90% of us will get so good at it that it'll take up a certain number of hours a week, and that's it. You know, Chad Carson went and lived in Ecuador, and he had like 100
yeah,
doors, right? And so he still managed a lot of those doors when he was in Ecuador. And you know how much time it took him? He'd spend a few hours on Friday doing it,
yeah,
but the rest of the time he spent with life. So I thought at one point that personal finance or financial independence were going to be my purpose after slowing down at work. And I couldn't have been more wrong. Those things will not fulfill you long term. They are tools. They're tools to get us to a better financial place. But they're not meaning. They're
yeah.
not purpose, at least for most of us. Now, I'm not saying they couldn't be purpose. For you, maybe that really is your in-depth purpose in life. But for most people, it isn't.
Well, let me ask. So I see my purpose as setting generational wealth up for my kids. Right, we have two, third on the way, and I see, and maybe this is, you know, as you go through different phases of your life, your purpose may change. Right, I think that's a fair statement. Um, I see my purpose as, number one, eliminating, or not eliminating, making myself have more available time to spend with them, right, as they grow up and get older. And then second purpose is to set them up with generational wealth, right, and allow them, not only for them but for their kids and their kids, right? So I see that as my purpose. But the closer, and goes back again to the comment I made earlier, is that the closer I get to that goal, then it's like, okay, now what? You know, let's think bigger. Let's think bigger. And I struggle with that. You know, there's a lot of people out there who will say, hey, I want to do this. And it is this lofty goal that's going to take them 5-10 years to get it. And I struggle with looking that far down the road. You know, so for me, it's like 1 year at a time, even less than that, 1/4 at a time, which is some of the things that we're getting into in the mastermind group is, you know, now it's 1 day at a time. And what can I do today that's going to affect that in the end result? So, yeah, it's, if you don't know your purpose, you're right. You're going to be I'm going to say this, you're going to be miserable if you're ever able to get to that point where you can leave your W-2 and just, get to that. Right.
Yeah, and I would say there's two things as you're talking about this. I'm thinking one is my kids are 11 and 14, and they go up to their room and want to do their own thing. So, if you're going into financial advice, it's because you want to spend more time with your kids. By the time you get there, and they may be teenagers, they may love you, but they might also have their own things.
No, you're right.
Something to think about. The other thing is, you actually have some of the answer already. Something is driving you to produce this show that we're doing right now, and something is driving you to start the Facebook group. So you're actually already starting to build some of your purpose. You just might not be identifying it that way. This community you're building around you doesn't go away just because you leave your W-2 job.
Right.
And you might find that some of this education piece, some of this creating communities, some of this may be teaching other people how to bring real estate into the W-2 life we all live. That can, for you, become part of your purpose.
Yeah.
And so you are actively building it. You just may not be connecting to that idea. And that was my problem too. As if I was a physician, and I started realizing that maybe my only purpose in life wasn't being a physician, but this whole time I was writing a blog and I was doing public speaking, and I just hadn't identified those as part of my purpose. Once I did, it was easy to transition away from my full-time job to a part-time job because I had a podcast to produce, and all of a sudden I was like, hey, I have Friday afternoons, I can do this.
Right.
And I have a blog post to write. So, hey, isn't it nice to have Monday morning off so I can do that? And I want to be part of a speakers bureau and travel to some other state to go give a talk on medicine. But now I have the time to do that. But I had to change my mindset, and I had to pivot away from my W-2 and start finding meaning in some of those other things that I actually was already doing.
Yeah. And you're right. One of the things, and I was just talking to my wife about this last night, is we have a new book every month in the mastermind group. And this month we're doing Miracle Morning Millionaires by Hal Elrod, and he partnered with somebody else. And I apologize, I can't remember those co-authors' name. But, so what we do is the book's assigned, or it's challenged, right? And then there's daily challenges that go along with the content of the book. And some of the group members are so engaged in this, and they're posting about how this is affecting their daily life. And I sent my wife last night, I said, look at this. I said, just read this and just know that when I first read this, I got chills. Like I was not expecting to impact folks like this is impacting. So anyway, the more on I've got about 5 minutes and then I've got to get back to work. So I've got two more questions for you. You mentioned earlier on borrowing money from family members when you guys were first starting out. Would you recommend doing that now? And if so, some advice around that. And would you do it again, I guess is a better question.
So it depends on your family members. So my parents were longtime real estate investors.
Yep.
And
so they knew, right?
Yeah. And being stealth wealth practitioners and very smart financially, they had, if I said, hey, lend me $50,000, that was not like a big deal for them.
Okay.
So I had that benefit. So I knew that I could borrow from my parents and that it wouldn't be an issue. I knew I was going to pay them back within a year or two. I knew that it wouldn't hurt them financially. So that was pretty easy. So it depends on your family. Right? If you have a parent or a grandparent or a sibling who's well off, who understands real estate, and you have a good relationship with, why not?
Yeah.
I'm always about getting around the system. If you can find a way to get around the system, great. I also used a line of credit. At the time, again, I knew it was short term because I was still really active in my W-2. I could plot out exactly how many months it would take me to pay off that line of credit. And the reason I did it is because I didn't want to liquidate some of my other assets, and it was worth it to pay a few percent to do that. So I don't think it's a bad thing, but every situation is different. It depends on the person.
And we all need to go find out who our rich uncles are, right? That's the next step. That's the next challenge for the W2 Capitalists.
Yeah, so, it doesn't hurt.
Yeah. The last question I got, and then if any of the other members have anything, give them the opportunity. But you mentioned growing up, watching your parents do this. You've got kids now. You said 14 and 11. So my kids are 4, 2, and 20 weeks from being here. So what are some of the things that you enjoyed growing up doing with your parents? Because we try to do as much as we can with them and show them the business and take them to properties and, hey, what are you doing, Dad? Well, we're going to check on one of our rental properties, kind of thing. What are some of the things that you did as a kid that you enjoyed that you transferred or tried to get your kids involved in as well? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So my parents took us to everything. So I would go with my stepdad for projects. I was never handy. I'm still not handy, but I watched him do lots of projects.
Yeah.
Some of it was just kitchen table talk, right? I heard
Yeah.
my mom and dad discussing the properties and the problems they were having and what was working and what wasn't. And hey, that piece of land, we really did well on that. So I kind of grew up with that as part of the normal discussion around the dinner table. So with my own kids, that's exactly what we do. I'm a big fan of financial modeling. You can try to teach your kids by didactic teaching. You can sit them down and tell them over and over again. But what they really notice is what you do. So we take them with us to interview new potential tenants. We take them with us to the realtor's office when we're signing a lease. They've been with us when we've been negotiating for a foreclosure. They've been with us as we've been doing work on the condos or on the house and been, see us arguing with the contractor or agreeing with the contractor.
Yeah.
Or they pretty much have seen it soup to nuts. So my goal is to expose them to everything and then allow them to decide where to go with it. And that's exactly what my parents did.
Yeah. And, so far, so my son's 4 and he's been to 9 closings.
Yeah,
so he's getting exposure, right?
No. And I think I'm a big fan of exposing them. If you model good financial behavior, most likely, if you're lucky, your kids will have reasonable beliefs about how to be a good financial steward.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree to that. James, Kim, Melody?
No, nothing additional. Doc G, thank you so much for spending time sharing with the group, giving us insight and wisdom through the journey that you've had. It's been very helpful, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I'll echo James's comment. Thank you very much for your time, Doc G. I will, once I get this ready to go and publish, I'll let you know where it goes. But once again, tell people where they can find out more about you.
So the easiest way is to go to my blog. It's diversefy.com, the word diverse, fi.com. I also, along with my co-host Paul Thompson, do a podcast called the What's Up Next podcast. These are next level financial independence panels where we discuss with 3 or 4 people from the personal finance community diverse topics. Our number 1 episode was actually about real estate. So check us out. But we talk about other things other than real estate also. And the idea is these are just these next level discussions. You can find me on Facebook. Doc Green is my name. It's I go by Doc G, but Facebook wouldn't let me do Doc G, so it's Doc Green. And then on Twitter, I am at Doc G Diversify.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Terry just joined us. Terry, I hate to do this, and I'm not joking, but we are just wrapping up. So I'll put everything on the replay, and I will talk to you guys. So the next call for the W2 Capitalist is Tuesday night. So I will talk to you guys then. James, I'm looking forward to seeing you there, buddy.
Yeah, I will be able to make that one.
All right,
I'm looking
good deal.
forward to it as well.
Good deal. Doc G, thank you very much again, and I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All right, thanks.